What I want to do now and in the next interviews is give a more detailed account of 4 of the areas I discuss. This will, I hope, give you a better idea of the overall structure of the book. These 4 areas are the attributes of God, problem of evil, miracles, and religious language. So let me start with chapter 1 and begin, appropriately enough, at the beginning with the attributes of God. The most common primary qualities ascribed to God are these. God must be all-powerful, or omnipotent, all-knowing, or omniscient, and all-good, or omnibenevolent. But God is also said to have other attributes. That his existence is independent of any other existences, technically expressed as necessary existence. That he must be incapable of experiencing emotions or passions, and so impassible. That he must be independent both of matter, and so immaterial, and of time, and so eternal, and of change, and so immutable. But very quickly we can see that having these attributes raises several philosophical difficulties. Let's just look at some of them. There are, for example, alleged contradictions within any given property. The most famous one has to do with the attribute of omnipotence as illustrated in the paradox of the stone. Can God create a rock so heavy that he can't lift it? This question, it would appear, cannot be answered in a way that is consistent with God's omnipotence. For if we say that God can create a rock so heavy that he cannot lift it, then it must be conceded that God lacks the power to lift that rock. And if we deny that God can create a rock so heavy that he cannot lift it, then it must be conceded that God lacks the power to create that rock. Either way, there is something that God cannot do which highlights, so it is held, the absurdity of the notion of omnipotence. This, then, is one example of an alleged inner contradiction within one property. But there are other contradictions. As James Rachels pointed out, there is another contradiction arising from the conception of God as a being worthy of worship. Now, if God is worthy of worship, and we assume he is because he's God, then this surely means that he can lay claim to our unqualified obedience. But if obedience is unqualified, then the believer must be required to abdicate his independence, his autonomy. But since autonomy is generally held to be an essential requirement of moral decision, no action is moral if you cannot freely choose to do it, then no being who is worthy of worship can make this demand and require that you give up your autonomy. Hence the contradiction. Either being a moral agent means that one cannot be a worshipper, i.e. subservient to God's commands, or being a worshipper means that one cannot be a moral agent. These, as I have said, are difficulties within the one property. But there are also difficulties when one contrasts one attribute with another. Take, for example, the incompatibility between God's omnipotence and his moral perfection. For if God is morally flawless, then presumably there are a number of things he cannot do, e.g. commit evil acts, which contradicts the claim that he should be able to do them, being omnipotent. Nor is it difficult to see where the incompatibility lies when we contrast God's omniscience with his ability to act freely as the only omnipotent being. An omniscient God must know what actions he will or will not perform in the future. But if God is omnipotent, he has a unique and infinite variety of choice. And choice here implies that he doesn't know what he will do in advance. So here we have another incompatibility. On one hand, he must know what will be done, and on the other, he cannot know. And finally, there are difficulties when we contrast certain divine properties with our empirical knowledge of the world. This is perhaps the easiest to grasp. Here, the most famous example has to do with the fact of evil or suffering. That God is omnibenevolent and thus wishes to eliminate evil, and omnipotent, and so has the power to eliminate evil, is, so it is claimed, inconsistent with the existence of evil. This dilemma, the so-called problem of evil, I discuss at considerable length in Chapter 3. The debate on these issues is extensive, and many philosophers, ancient and modern, have struggled with them. And perhaps in typical philosophical fashion, one way round them these difficulties is to redefine the attributes. Let me take the idea of omnipotence as a case in point. This could be redefined, not to mean that God can do anything, as Descartes thought, but that God can do only that which is intrinsically possible. This being the case, it remains quite consistent with God's omnipotence that he cannot perform a self-contradictory task. So God may be able to create the universe and restore the dead to life, but his omnipotence is not compromised if he cannot undo the past, know that which is false, or, indeed, create a rock he cannot lift. Another way round these difficulties is to define or redefine omnipotence in terms of maximal power. This means that God's power is unsurpassable and that no being therefore has more power than God. But what it doesn't mean is that all power belongs to God and that all other agents are therefore powerless. So others can act as autonomous causal agents and bring about something that God cannot bring about. This is a central claim of the so-called process theologians associated primarily with Whitehead and Hartshal. This, I hope, gives you some idea of the issues that I discuss in Chapter 1. There, of course, they're presented in much greater detail in the general introduction, and as I've already mentioned, they come with the specific extracts which are in turn coupled with the useful aids to study, with the separate introductions and bibliographies for each of the readings, with the list of key texts, a comprehensive guide to further reading, and finally a set of useful examination questions. My intention in doing all this is indeed to be of use myself to both the student and the professor.